They saw him and decided everything in a single glance. Not who he was, not what he had earned, just what they believed he represented. In that moment, doors quietly closed, respect vanished, and judgment took its place without a single word being spoken. He stood there, unaware that everything he had worked for was about to be questioned, dismissed, and nearly taken from him. But what happened next didn't just expose their mistake. It forced everyone watching to confront something far deeper. How far can a single assumption go before it destroys everything in its path? It was the kind of life built quietly, step by step, earned, not given. Every morning, he showed up before anyone else, long before the city fully woke, carrying the weight of expectations he never spoke about. He had learned early that being good wasn't always enough, so he made sure to be exceptional. No shortcuts, no excuses, just discipline, consistency, and a belief that eventually it would all pay off. People who truly knew him saw reliability, focus, and calm confidence. But not everyone cared to look that closely. To some, he was just another face that fit a narrative they had already written in their minds. It wasn't loud or obvious, just subtle shifts in tone, longer stares, quieter dismissals. The kind of things easy to ignore until they weren't. That day started no differently. Everything was in place, everything he had worked for within reach. But beneath the surface, something was already beginning to shift. Eyes were watching a little more closely. Judgments were forming a little faster. And before he even realized it, the moment that would challenge everything he had built was already unfolding. At first, it was subtle, so subtle it could almost be ignored. A pause that lasted a second too long. A glance exchanged between people who hadn't even spoken to him yet. The kind of tension that didn't announce itself, but settled quietly in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. He felt it before he fully understood it, like a shift in the room that no one was willing to acknowledge. Then it started to take shape. The opportunity he had worked toward, the one that was supposed to mark a turning point, suddenly felt just out of reach. Not because he wasn't ready, but because something invisible had placed a barrier in front of him. Questions came, but not the kind meant to understand him. They were sharper, more pointed, digging for doubt where there should have been none. Every answer he gave seemed to be weighed differently, measured against a standard no one had defined out loud. He adjusted, stayed composed, refused to let it show. Years of discipline had taught him how to navigate moments like this, how to remain steady even when everything around him shifted. But the pressure kept building. Then came the moment that made it undeniable. A decision was made, quickly, almost too quickly, one that didn't match the facts, didn't match his effort, didn't match anything he had proven. It was clean, quiet, and final. No explanation that made sense. No acknowledgement of what he had brought to the table. Just a conclusion that felt predetermined long before he ever walked in. The room moved on as if nothing had happened. But for him, everything had. A heat rose in his chest. Not just frustration, but something deeper. The realization that this wasn't about performance. It wasn't about qualifications. It was about perception. About a story someone else had written for him without ever asking who he really was. And still he stayed. He didn't argue. Didn't react the way they might have expected. Instead, he observed. Every glance, every subtle signal, every inconsistency, it all began to connect. What once felt like isolated moments now formed a pattern too clear to ignore. Then something shifted again. A detail surfaced, small, almost insignificant at first. But the more he looked at it, the more it didn't add up. The decision, the behavior, the sudden change in tone, it all pointed to something they hadn't intended for him to notice. And in that moment, the power dynamic began to change. Because what they saw as a quiet dismissal, he was starting to see as something else entirely. Something that could expose everything. But the question was, would anyone believe him before it was too late? Everything came to a head in a single, suffocating moment. The room that once felt controlled and predictable suddenly turned cold, almost hostile. Eyes that had quietly judged him before were now fixed on him with certainty, as a verdict had already been delivered. The tension was no longer hidden. It was direct, heavy, impossible to ignore. What had been subtle discrimination now stood fully exposed, undeniable in its intent. And then it happened. A final decision was announced, one that erased everything he had built in an instant. Not delayed, not reconsidered, just taken, stripped away without hesitation, as if his efforts had never mattered in the first place. The weight of it hit all at once. Years of discipline, sacrifice, and belief, reduced to nothing by a judgment that had nothing to do with who he truly was. For a brief second, everything inside him froze. The anger, the disbelief, the crushing realization that no matter how much he had done right, it still wasn't enough to outrun what they saw on the surface. It wasn't just rejection, it was erasure. But then something shifted. That small detail he had noticed earlier, the one that didn't make sense, suddenly became clear. It connected everything. The rushed decision, the inconsistencies, the quiet bias that had guided every moment. And just like that, the narrative they had tried to control began to crack. The power in the room started to slip. Because now, he wasn't just standing there as someone being judged. He was standing there with the truth. And as the weight of that truth settled in, one question hung in the air, heavier than anything else. What happens when the person they tried to silence becomes the one who exposes it all? The silence that followed was different this time. What once felt like a quiet dismissal now carried weight. Uneasy, shifting, undeniable. The truth didn't explode all at once. It unfolded piece by piece in a way no one in that room could ignore anymore. The inconsistencies he had noticed, the pattern he had quietly pieced together, it all surfaced. And when it did, the same people who had been so certain just moments before found themselves facing something they couldn't easily dismiss. The decision that had stripped everything from him didn't hold the same power anymore. It began to unravel under scrutiny, exposing not just a mistake, but a mindset. One built on assumptions, on unchecked bias, on the dangerous belief that appearance could define worth. For him, the moment wasn't about victory. It wasn't loud or celebratory. It was something deeper, a quiet reclaiming of everything that had been taken from him in that instant. The respect, the recognition, the truth of who he was. But even as the situation corrected itself, something within him had already changed. Because moments like that don't just pass. They stay. They reshape the way you see the world, the way you move through it, the way you prepare for the next time. Because deep down, you know there could always be a next time. And that's the part that lingers. This wasn't just his story. It never was. It reflects a reality that countless others face every day. Moments where judgment comes before understanding, where opportunity is filtered through bias before it's ever earned. The room may have shifted. The outcome may have changed. But the question it leaves behind is far bigger than one moment, one decision, one person. How many others never get the chance to prove the truth before the judgment becomes permanent? More importantly, how much longer will that continue before it's no longer ignored?